All right, welcome to our bi-monthly Saturday presentation. Today we are going to tackle suicide awareness, being that September is Suicide Awareness Month, which promotes um, awareness about risk factors, protective factors, also common myths associated with suicide, all leading to, the hope or the desired outcome of increased suicide prevention. So we can go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. Thank you. So let's talk really first about the different types of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So, suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts are thoughts about ending your life or the desire for death. They can be either passive. An example of a passive suicidal thought would be like if you were driving and you were like, you know, I should crash into that tree, or I should jump. Those are fleeting thoughts that you really, a lot of times might be classified as intrusive thoughts. You really weren't thinking about it. You don't know where it came from. You probably, go, what was that? But those are called passive suicide ideation. Maybe when you're having a bad day, it might be something like, well, I bet you if I died, nobody would miss me. But then, a couple hours later, you're like, oh, I was tripping. That's classified as passive suicidal ideation. Active suicidal ideation is going to be when it's something that you actually think about frequently. So it's something that reoccurring thoughts, about what it might be if you killed yourself, how you would kill yourself, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go on with these thoughts and behaviors. Non suicidal self injury, sometimes just called SI, is intentionally damaging one's body tissue by cutting or burning or any type of means of harm without any intent to die as a result. The reason why this is included in here is because sometimes people who experience self injury sometimes escalate at some point to suicidal thoughts and behaviors, or actual suicide attempts. Suicide attempts being non fatal self injurious acts with some intent to die as a result. Um, a lot of times, I'm not gonna say a lot of times, sometimes the person is unsuccessful unintentionally, like they really intended to kill themselves, but it just didn't happen. Or it wasn't an all out attempt, but what we may hear or refer to as a cry for help. So they are experiencing suicidal thoughts. They are making attempts. I don't want to say they're not wholehearted attempts, but they're not putting the full level of energy that they may need in that attempt in hopes that someone might, support them or get them to the help that they need in that moment. So suicide is when the person is actually successful in taking their life. And suicide, intentional suicide, is going to have a plan, it's going to have means, and it's going to have intent. So that's one of the first things that when I'm assessing people for their level of risk as far as suicide, I ask them, do they have those things in place? Do you have a plan? Do you have means? Like, how are you going to do this? How are you going to commit this? And when do you intend to do it? Um, and if they're able to give me that information, that puts them at extremely high risk. It may even be imminent risk by that point, like unless they are hospitalized at some point, they are going to commit that act. Okay, next slide, please. So here's some stats. 50,000 Americans in 2023 committed suicide, which was a record high for this country. So that's approximately 125 a day. And then there were also 1.6 million suicide attempts. Annually, worldwide, there's 703,000 suicides a year. Males are more likely to commit suicide, with 80% of suicide deaths being male. So about 24 out of 100,000 are male versus 6 out of 100,000 being female. The highest um, ethnic groups or race that commit suicide in this country, first being American Indian, Alaskan Natives, second being whites, third being blacks, and fourth being Hispanics. Black males have actually advanced to a rate that's kind of scary in the last couple of years. If you look at those stats, in 2013, 36 out of 100,000 suicide victims were Black men. And now, well, about 2 years ago, which is the latest data that I could locate, 104. And so that is a topic that needs to be addressed, and they're doing a lot of research just trying to determine why at this point in time that number for that specific demographic has literally jumped in the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So suicide rates are higher among adults aged 25 to 34. And then the other age group is 75 to 84, with the highest rate existing, a suicide rate that is, among 85 years or older. So the majority of the people who commit suicide are 85 years or older. 85 years or older. We'll talk a little bit more about why that could be impacting that demographic a little bit later. Firearms account for more than half of the suicide deaths as far as the means. And the three top professions that have high suicide rates are medical doctors, dentists, and police officers. Next slide, please. I thought this graph was important for us to take a look at because it shows how the numbers have jumped up from 2018 to 2022, starting at the onset of COVID. And I thought that was important for us to see or visualize because it speaks to the level of stress, isolation, sudden life changes, health concerns, fears that could frequently be risk factors for suicide. So, in the middle of a pandemic with an experience that people had never had before, where they're isolated and cut off from their families, a lot of health concerns and health problems, and a lot of stress related to financial security and things of that nature, the suicide rate skyrocketed. So that, I wanted you guys to see that visually, a direct correlation to those particular risk factors and people feeling hopeless and lost and feeling like suicide is their only option. Next screen, please. So common risk factors. So mental health issues are common risk factors for suicide. Conditions like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety, and addiction increase the risk of suicide. Though suicide is actually a symptom of those conditions. If you were to look at the symptoms of schizophrenia, it would include high risk of suicide. The conditions often lead, the mental health conditions themselves lead to feelings of hopelessness and despair, guilt and shame, and intense emotional pain related to having to, navigate all of the other symptoms and interactions and relationships, choices and behaviors that may be related to that disorder can leave that person feeling, any number of emotional pain. So additionally, risk increase when there's a lack of access and or engagement with mental health supports.
Increasing.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay. So, the likelihood that suicide might be a risk factor for someone with a mental health condition is very high, particularly if it's untreated. Chronic health issues, conditions like cancer, diabetes, paralysis, and terminal illness are frequently linked to increased risk of suicide. And that takes us back to that 85-year demographic. Typically, people struggle a lot once they reach the age where they feel like they are don't have a reason to live because their health is so bad, or they may have no family members left. So then that'll point to the loneliness piece or the lack of connection to other people piece that we'll talk about in a little bit. Substance abuse is a common risk factor. It impairs judgment, escalates mental health issues, and increases impulsivity and reckless behaviors, making people more vulnerable to suicidal thoughts and actions. Environmental life and stressors, financial problems, relationship issues, bullying, work, loss of a loved one, major life changes, all of the things that we experienced in COVID, for example, can contribute to feelings of hopelessness and despair. Next screen, please. There's the loneliness and the social isolation that I was talking about. We, as you know, as part of our makeup, we need to be connected with other people, and when we're not, it raises issues of depression and sadness, and puts us at risk for feeling useless, and unconnected and unnecessary, I should say, and that it could be a high risk for suicide as well. Again, with the health issues and in our senior population, if we perceive ourselves to be a burden to others, that's also a risk where we feel like, well, let me just take myself out of my misery, and then that way I can free up my family. They don't have to worry about caring for me. They don't have to worry about any expenses related to me. So that feeling like if I'm gone, everyone else will be better off is a big risk factor. Having access to lethal methods such as firearms or medications can increase the likelihood of a suicide attempt. Remember, we're talking about an impulsive action, an intense emotional moment that leads to impulsivity. So if there's something there and accessible, that's going to increase the chances that person is going to be able to commit suicide. A family history of suicide, genetic, environmental, or learned factors can increase the individual's risk. So they're still doing research as far as whether or not, or trying to isolate exactly what genetic component can be passed down within, from person to person, that will make suicide a risk factor for that family. But there is a link. They just haven't been able to necessarily pinpoint it. But then environmental and learned factors are going to be, or can include, aggressive and how aggressive and impulsive type behavior patterns that are within that family, where it's pretty learned and modeled that this could be how we handle extreme stress. And so that person kind of, what's the word, takes that lesson and embodies it. So they're kind of like, oh, okay, well, here's my answer, because this is the answer that maybe my dad used, or maybe the answer that my aunt used. And so, it makes sense now. So kind of seeing that behavior pattern, and also being from a family or having personalities or mental health concerns that include aggression and impulsive behaviors could also be risk factors. And previous suicide attempts are significantly increase the chances that the person will try it again. Next, because they continue to struggle with the same things, and without getting any help, there's a high risk of them attempting again. So the top one is a very common, let's see if I can hide this. I can't see the top of it. The top one is a very common myth that suicide is a selfish act. And it's understandable, right? The people that are left in the wake of a person that committed suicide are definitely going to have the same questions about how could they do that? What were they thinking? Were they thinking about the people they were leaving behind? Were they thinking about how that would make me feel? And that's a valid thought, right? But it takes a little more understanding of the person's mind frame and what they're struggling, and the impulsivity of the act to help us to understand. that many people, are one, maybe thinking that their family would be better off without them. And the level of emotional pain, uh, coupled with that impulsivity, um, is what brings that about. And so the actual thought of, hey, I'm going to do this right now, may have gone away if that person had the proper tools as far as support and um, professional help. But if they didn't have those things, and then, like I mentioned before, and then they have the access, it's kind of like a perfect storm in that moment, which is why it's so important when they tell us, be nice to everyone you see, because you never know what someone's going through. It's kind of like that quick and that impulsive that the person could be saved. So if we're always, and we'll get into that a little bit more about understanding the risk, and so we can recognize when someone is at risk. But if we are, you know, it's a big deal to make sure we're mindful of what people are going through, even if they don't appear to be suffering as much pain as they are, because it does, to get to this point where you want to take your life, it does involve an intense emotional pain without any thought of it stopping. Like, you believe that it can't get any worse than this. And so suicide is going to be, in your mind, a relief. Another myth is suicide can't be prevented. Suicide is preventable by doing things that we're doing right now, talking about it. A lot of people don't like to talk about it. It's a taboo subject. It makes people feel uncomfortable. But if we talk about it, we can get the information out there. We can talk about the protective factors. We can talk about the risk factors and the warning signs. And that's the way that we as individuals can help get that suicide rate down, particularly for those high risk demographics. Another myth is talking about suicide may encourage the idea. Exactly the opposite, like I was saying. We have to talk about it because that's how we raise awareness. Suicidal people just want attention is another myth. Another myth. This is a harmful stereotype that does not validate the level of pain that people are going through, um, and what they're experiencing. As it says here, it's the genuine emotional pain and suffering. Um, Now, some people, from a clinical standpoint, I can tell you that there are instances when people with mental health um, diagnoses may use suicide or the threat of suicide as a manipulation tactic, but it does not mean they are still not at risk, right? So they may have learned, and I've seen this in some adolescents, they may have learned that if I say this, people will respond. If I pretend, or if I, claim I'm going to kill myself, people will react. In that moment, they're using that as a tool, but that does not mean at all that they don't have, very real risk of suicide, and may not, and those may come to light when they're not even talking about it. So it's a very real risk that they may try to kill themselves and never speak of it to the people that may have manipulated with saying that in the past, if that makes sense. Another reason why that's a concern is because if a person is using suicide attempts in that moment to get attention, there's a high risk of accidental suicide, where they didn't intend to take that many pills, or they didn't intend to cut that deep. Um, so even with that person behaving or using their mental health in a negative way at that moment, they still present as a very high risk. Another myth: suicide is a rational option for a really bad situation. When we're talking about suicide and suicidal thoughts, we're talking about distorted thinking, extreme emotional pain, again, and hopelessness. It's not a rational decision, but a desperate decision, a desperate response, and a permanent decision for a temporary problem. That's one of the things that I say frequently to people who are struggling, that this is a permanent decision. You can't come back from this. So let's figure out what we can do to handle this now, without causing so much pain to you and the rest of your family. Um, on the topic of distorted thinking, we have to. I want to just say real quickly in regards to neurologically, or how our brain processes. We have two parts of our brain, and clinically we call it the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. The downstairs brain is responsible for keeping us safe. So it holds our memories and it reminds us if something feels dangerous, if something was painful, if we're in some type of harm. And so that's where our body or our brain responds to stress. Our upstairs brain is where our body uses um, rationale and intellect and thinking through and problem solving. Under extreme stress and duress, the connections from the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain are broken. And so the logical part of your brain and the part that is telling you that we're in danger or that we're suffering or that we're in pain are not connected, which is one of the reasons why it makes it difficult to navigate those suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors, and leads to and contributes, I should say, to the impulsivity. So understanding that it's also part of the way your brain may be working at that particular moment is also a contributing factor to, a person attempting suicide. Additionally, some medications interrupt or disrupt that connection, which is why some of medications carry a risk of suicide with them as well, particularly for young adults. The myth of it's impossible to know if someone is contemplating suicide. Um, Frequently, there are signs. A lot of people, will go more into detail about what those signs are. Some are pretty obvious. We've heard, if someone starts giving stuff away, if someone, comes up to you and, gives you a big hug, like a long hug, and starts talking about how much they love you, and that's not normally how they communicate with you. Those are kind of warning signs that we've gotten used to hearing about, but there are a couple more. So again, that's the importance of the awareness. That's the importance of engaging in stuff like this, getting the information so you'll be able to detect those warning signs. All right, next slide, please. All right, so here we are talking about suicide. I want to kill myself, or I wish I were dead. Acquiring weapons or stockpiling pills, withdrawing, social isolation, withdrawing from family, friends, fixation on death or dying or violence, expressing that they feel like a burden, feeling trapped or hopeless, self-destructive behaviors like an increase in use of alcohol or drugs or reckless driving, giving away possessions or organizing affairs without any apparent reason, saying goodbye, and displaying a personality change. So, like if level of anxiety or anger or sadness increases to an amount where the person is kind of just basically not um, acting like themselves. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about prevention. Like I said, learning the warning signs and the risk factors and the protective factors of suicide is a good first step. I'll talk a little bit more in our last slide about the protective factors. Reaching out for help. If you are a person that is struggling with suicidal thoughts or behaviors, it's very important that you reach out for support. Um, another myth is that reaching out is a sign of weakness, but it's actually the opposite. It's a step that you're taking to keep yourself safe, um, and can make a significant difference with the tools and support that you receive in how you're better able to navigate life moving forward. So maintain connections with family and friends. Maintain connections with people It's important. That's another thing, another issue that came about with COVID, that we were so socially isolated, and people weren't able to connect. And that's something we need. Connections with people actually, connections and physical touch actually release chemicals in our brain that treat, um, the symptoms of depression and anxiety. So it's important that we make sure that we're staying connected. Let's get off the phone, get off the chat, get off the Zoom, and meet people in person, right? Because again, that touching and that in-person communication is beneficial to our health, physical and mental. Prioritize family time, join a club, a group, or organization, volunteer time. These are all ways that you can maintain connections with people. Practice lethal means safety. So this is one that may be, good for our parents, may be good for people with partners with history of suicide or suicidal ideation, where we just have to make sure that we don't have anything available in that impulsive moment. So, secure firearms, knives, medications, cleaners, ropes, and any other household items that could cause serious injury or death. Practice for your for yourself or promote with people that you love self-care, to focus on activities that can be done to ensure physical and mental fitness, um, to relieve stress, help us feel better, and improve our overall health. So our last slide is going to be some of those protective factors that we can learn, or things that we can keep in mind. Okay, let me make sure I'm doing this. Let me make sure my family members are doing this. My parents are doing this. My children are doing this. So strong social support is important. Having a network of family and friends, who provide emotional support, access to mental health care. So having the access and then being willing to engage in the access are all going to be protective factors. What we talked about earlier were the risk factors. These things are what we do to bring down those risks. So, for example, if you are from a family with a history of suicide, you are going to be a person who needs to be very aware of these protective factors. Similar to if you were a family that came from drug addiction, knowing that information, having that information, and being aware, okay, since this is a genetic disposition in my family, I need to be on guard and take extra precautions. It's the same thing with these protective factors in regards to suicide. Build up problem solving skills to help, with managing stress and adversity. Again, when the top brain is engaged, when our upstairs brain is engaged, we're able to involve in problem engage, excuse me, in problem solving skills. The key is during moments of stress, we have to have the skills and the tools to calm our body down so our brain can reconnect. And so, what's trying to keep us safe or warn us of danger or of pain needs to remain connected with problem solving and, rational thinking. And so, that would involve when we're talking about, talking to someone, taking the deep breaths, taking the walks, meditation. Those are the things that we use to bring our brain connections back together so that we can manage whatever we're managing, whatever level of stress we're managing in that moment. Positive life events such as marriage, birth, or a child can be protective. Sense of purpose, having a sense of purpose. So being engaging in activities that you enjoy, that bring you peace, that help other people, things that you might be passionate about, um, boost that sense of purpose. Connection, we talked about that, in a micro way and a macro way. So within our family and then also within the community. And then practicing lethal, means safety. So limiting access to those, weapons or items that could be harmful can help reduce the risk. So that's all I got, guys. I would love to hear, some feedback and answer any questions that you may have, because I know this is a very important topic. Um, and so I want to be able to support you with any other questions or concerns you may have.
Yeah, Nikki, I have actually two comments. Actually, I
Okay.
had a colleague that committed suicide. This was years ago, but the story that was put out was it was a health issue that caused his death. I only found out recently that it was suicide, and it points to people feel the shame. The family feels the shame of it, so they cover it up, and they miss an opportunity to help
Mm-hmm.
other people. That was
Exactly.
the one thing. And the other thing, I'm not sure if you mentioned this in the beginning, but I heard a person say about someone who had committed suicide that it was a shame that their faith wasn't strong enough to
Mm-hmm.
prevent that. And that should be one of the myths. Many times it has nothing to do with how strong your faith is. So uh, we just have a lot to do in our community to make people aware. So
Most definitely. And you made some very good points. Particularly the one about a missed opportunity to
mhm,
share.
mhm,
But that stigma, that shame is big, right? It's generational, it's societal. So it makes, while I understand it's exactly what you said, a missed opportunity to save other families from experiencing what they experienced. And you're 100% right about the faith. It doesn't necessarily have to be any
mhm,
indication of their level of faith, but it also can act as a protective factor, right?
mhm.
So leaning into spirituality, leaning into a church, leaning into whatever religion or higher being that you connect with can be a protective factor.
Correct. And many times, like the people that are deeply depressed, it's a chemical issue, from what I understand, for some
Yes,
people. So leaning into your faith would be good, but you want to get to the point where you address that chemical issue as well.
exactly,
So
exactly. Yep, yep. So, your treatment plan may include, seeing a therapist and a psychologist. And
correct.
that's where you would get the medications.
Hmm.
And I think it's important. This is a good time to mention as far as the medications, because I know there's a lot of stigma surrounding the medications as well. But if you do decide to go the medication route, understand that you still need a therapist. So you can have a therapist without being on medications. But if you are on medications for mental health, it is highly recommended that that you see a therapist, because you still need the strategies and the tools and the support and the talking and the processing. That's what's going to help. They work together with the medicine.
Correct. Mhm.
So thank you so much for that comment. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Mhm. Thank-
Anyone else have anything else they want to add, or any questions, any stories? Okay.
I did want to add something related to what Barzella mentioned. She said she had a colleague that committed suicide, and at the family covered it up. And I had the very same experience at work. We had a senior level VP that we we could see on our Zoom calls that he was losing a lot of weight. And
mhm.
so everybody was like, oh, he has an illness and, maybe cancer and all these things. And then the next thing you know, he passed away, and we were told that he had passed away due to this long-standing illness. And then maybe 2 years later, we found out that it was actually suicide. And I
Hmm.
just thought, wow, because I guess the first thought for me is like, and he was a young guy. I mean, we're maybe late 30s, maybe early 40s, to be a senior VP of a tech company. It's just like, you in your mind you think they have it all, and how could he do that, and so, it just, from basically the teachings that you shared today, lets us know that no matter what your status is, because one of the things you mentioned was that doctors and some
Hmm.
other high profession people are high in the number. It's like, we just assume financial and career gain, is like, what could you possibly be sad about? And so obviously it's bigger than that. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. And yes, most definitely, people tend to, or society tends to equate happiness and success with money and title, right? But definitely when we're talking about mental health, um, money and success are fall to the wayside. And so it's going to be all about these things, the strategies and the supports, and the understanding and the awareness. So that's a very big point, and leads me back to you never know what people are going through. Like you never know what's actually happening inside that person, what they're really experiencing, um, and what their day-to-day mental is. So it's just important for us to do our best to be kind. Well, that's all I have, guys. Thank you so much for coming out. I hope that you are able to share some of this with people around you, again, so we can build the awareness. And this will also be on the website and on our YouTube, correct, Lynn?
Yes, on the YouTube, on our YouTube channel and our website. And the website, lmfoutreach.org, and the YouTube channel, LMF Foundation Inc. And also, just in case you guys are not aware, our blog that is also attached to our website is also about suicide awareness. So
Mm-hmm.
please check them out when you get a chance, or share and share.
And share. Yeah, and direct people to the website or YouTube if you know someone that may was not able to come today, but you think that this information would be helpful for them. And thank you guys for always showing up and showing out. We appreciate you.
Thank you. This was
Thank you for the
good.
great information.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I don't know if Lynn mentioned that we have moved this meeting to bi-monthly, so we'll see you guys again in 2 months. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
You as well. Thank you.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.